How many of you have seen that story that's been on the news really a little bit more last week than this week about the man who was driving his pickup truck on the ice and he slipped, lost control, went down in the ditch and then flew up and over a 60-foot embankment, rolling 2 or 3 times in the air and landing on his wheels. And then finding himself with about 3 feet of water in the car, he got out, looked across the river and climbed back up the 60 feet to find help. Basically, considering what he did, uninjured, a couple of cuts, bruises. Now, that was on the news, I don't know, about a week ago, but then I saw this last week. It was with a newspaper story, and sometimes they give you a little bit more detail in the newspaper story. And certainly in the TV one, he was talking about how grateful he was to be alive and not being quite sure how it had happened, given that he went over a 60-foot embankment. And in that newspaper article, he just said, you know, when I started to go over, he said, I closed my eyes and I said, Lord, I'm coming home. And that was it. Now, I relate to that story because that same thing happened to me, not quite the same, but a little bit like that about 8 years ago. And I think I've shared this story before here, but as this story happened, it came to me as I was remembering my own story of maybe driving a little too fast on a wet road in a very small 2-seater car, passing a semi, trying to pass a semi, when suddenly I was flying. If you hydroplaned perfectly, which I was doing, the steering wheel was totally out of my control, and I did exactly like this guy did. I just closed my eyes and said, I guess this is it. And a few minutes later, I was on the other side of the highway. I put it in gear, drove back to the exit I had just left, and went home. Not the home that this guy is talking about. But I have to tell you that in that moment of sliding a medium, I guess, and I know I turned around, at least did a 360 or 1 or 2, because I could feel them with my eyes closed. I had this just sense of peace and serenity. The sense that I was in God's hands, and I didn't really expect it to come out well, but that was okay. I was in God's hands. So I had a sense that that's where this man who went over the 60-foot embankment was. One of those times of feeling in a very powerful way, and yet in a very gentle way, God's presence. Like God was there with me. Now, I think what happens in our lives too often is that it takes these near death, or looking into the face of death is maybe a more accurate way to say that, experiences before we open our hearts to God. In fact, in this sense, it takes an experience like that to surrender ourselves entirely into God's hands. Not that we all do, but I think most of us had those moments where you just suddenly surrender and you feel the expression of God. But our call in the Gospels is not to wait until one of these near-death kinds of experiences or these frightening experiences. We don't have to have either a literal or a proverbial car wreck in order to let go enough to let God, to let go, to let God in. Our call as followers and disciples of Christ is to surrender and invite God into all parts of our lives at all times, in all situations, and to be open, heart and mind and spirit, to God's direction, God's purpose, rather than our own. It shouldn't take us losing control to surrender. In fact, God calls us that even when we are in control of our lives, to choose to surrender. This passage from Mark of the Transfiguration is an experience of the divine presence in our midst, in the midst of the disciples and Jesus on the mountaintop. And they respond much as you might expect, or the way people often respond in times of, we're told, when they meet the face of God, or in my case, backward, when we have fear. Sometimes that's when we're most open to God. But that's how they respond, is with fear. And then their second response is, let's build a monument. Let's build a little house to bring God's presence in this one place, on this high place, this one time. Because this is where we want to leave God, in this safe place on the mountain. We love the experience. We don't want God messing with our lives all the time. And then Jesus says to them, tells them that no, we're going back down off the mountain. Because the presence of God is not intended to stay on mountaintops. It's not intended to be only when we're afraid. It's to come with us into life. It's to come into all that we do, to not be rare that we experience God in our midst, but to be common that we experience God in our midst, that we are willing to surrender. Sometimes that surrender really isn't all that hard. It's like this morning, to be willing to come into a worship service and just relax and enjoy the music and the dance and the saying. We're just going to experience this moment of joy, the harmony and balance of music, the ability to clown, to dance, to laugh, which is always within us, but there's something about human nature, or maybe it's the way we've civilized ourselves, that we think we have to hold those in until proper moments. And a worship service like this is one when we can say no, to have fun and to enjoy and to let loose to all the experiences of what it is to be alive is something that can happen whenever we surrender to the power of God, the joy of God, the beauty of God. And so in worship we experience that, and even maybe in some ways in a different and more exciting way when we do it with this kind of energized music and someone on stilts in Sunday school or at church and worship. A sense of fun can be from God. Kind of shakes us loose a little bit. But we also need to surrender our lives and be open to receive God's call and purpose in the rest of our lives. In fact, as a disciple of Christ, it is not to bring people to less lives, it's to bring them to more abundant lives, to more joy and purpose in all that we do. Our purpose and our call when we surrender to God is, the surrender is really to trying to always lift ourselves up, but to rather, when we surrender to God, to lift all people up, including ourselves, to seek all potential, all possibility, no limitations. What is it? What are the gifts that are within us? What are the ways we have of living in abundance with our hearts, minds, and souls and spirits and everything that's a part of us? What is it that holds us back? And what are the opportunities we have to live fully? We as a church have started a new process of looking at how do we create a new vision of claiming the abundance of life for ourselves and for the people in our neighborhood and in our community. We're doing that partly, we're beginning that process through the 40 days, which is an opportunity of opening our hearts to hear the word of the Lord. And I hope you notice that there is a little bit different plan that's listed in this little sheet here of signing up to explore what it is that God has in mind for us. And then from that, our new vision will be a call to act in the way God has called us to act as we learn how Jesus acted, how Jesus lived. But the first step is to surrender to the divine in our midst. The first step is to surrender. Let God in and let God direct us. Lent's purpose is to open our hearts so that we can begin to change our lives. Lent is not about a temporarily letting go of something or giving up something for a few weeks. Lent is about opening our hearts so that we can receive God's direction and God's purpose and transform our lives. With the resurrection of Jesus, we too become resurrected to new possibilities. So Lent is not about giving up for a little bit, it may mean setting aside some of the fears and self-focus that keeps us from surrendering to God focus, but not for a short period of time, but to prepare our hearts so that our lives and the lives of those people we share the call of Christ, the gospel of Christ with, all of those people's lives can be transformed into the way of the kingdom. Today we sing and we dance so that we can remember that the call of Christ is to dance God's tune all the time. Amen.